Welcome back. This time, I want to make an historical parallel between 1938 and 2022-24. Number one, uh, in both 1938 and now, we had a foe whose economy depended on war. In 1938, it was Hitler. Now it's Putin. So it was the way the German economy had devoted itself to an arms race made clear that they needed to use those weapons. Otherwise, they would end up in a recession that could have hurt Hitler. The same way here, Russia's economy is trapped in a death spiral. It cannot afford to win or lose. It needs to continue. And even if there is even if Trump forces Ukraine to a shameful peace, Putin will need to start another conflict because otherwise the economy he has created will create instability inside Russia. And you may say there have been many forecasts about the imminent demise of the Russian economy because of the sanctions. But that has not happened, number one, because the sanctions have been unenforced. That has been pretty much Biden's fault because we are talking about, in most cases, sanctions that were enforced through affidavit. So it basically meant that you had to say that you were not exporting forbidden materials to Russia to be believed. Um, for instance, even though, for instance, in the case of Turkey, Russia sold its blend to Turkey, where it was mixed with other blends and then exported to Europe. That was considered in compliance. So, but the other, the more important lifeline the Russian economy has had is China. If China stops trade with Russia today, the war will end in a few weeks because that's the only way the that's the main way, excuse me, in which Putin can continue doing war. Number two, the same way that in 1938 many appeasers pressed Czechoslovakia to surrender the Sudeten to Hitler, and in 1939 Hitler took the rest of Czechoslovakia. Despite that example, there are many imbeciles who want to pressure Ukraine to make concessions to Putin, knowing well that because Putin needs to keep waging war because of his economy, as another war would be imminent. Wars. Imagine the average Ukrainian being told that after all the blood and treachery they have sacrificed in these 3 years, they will have to give anyway concessions, territorial concessions, about 20% of their territory, and no guarantees. Just or in other words, just the same guarantees they got in the Budapest memorandum and in the Minsk Accords. Unless you are overestimating the Ukrainian sense of humor, I would not be surprised they learned the wrong lesson, as many Georgians did, and prefer to side with Putin, considering that NATO is not reliable. Number three, naive pacifism blinds us to the real nightmare scenario, which is a war against Russia and China. Because the real nightmare scenario is not a war with Russia, as long as we don't try to defraud Putin, of course, case in which China would jump into the war. The worst case scenario is a war in which both of them, both Xi Jinping and Putin, come to believe that they are the only way they can keep power is by joining forces. Otherwise, please stop believing that nonsense that Biden embraced, that any crossing any red line is going to lead to escalation. So what? As long as as long as you just expel Russia from Ukraine's territory the same way as Saddam Hussein was expelled from Kuwait and not more, I believe you don't have you don't have to fear the worst case scenario. And you don't have to fear the worst case scenario because, as I mentioned in another video, Putin is not a sociopath. He is a psychopath. In other words, he thinks like a mafia boss. And he wants to survive, to keep power, to survive, and to enjoy all the wealth he has stolen from Russia. He and his oligarchs. He doesn't want to go in flames for go to the end, to the last soldier for the glory of, no, that's not Putin. Number four, as we have mentioned, China needs Russia because it's its top military ally, and Putin can't survive without Xi. And you see, I mentioned the worst case scenario. Uh, just you have to imagine both enemies combined. Because and you may say, but you don't see Putin has a lot of nukes and China doesn't. No, but Putin has a weak economy, and China has the financial resources to keep a war going for a long time. So consider that. Now, number five, if the idea is to isolate Putin, what can we do about China? Well, China has a big problem that is its exports overcapacity. That problem is not going to solve by itself and is self-inflicted. So it's his fault because he has doubled down in that bet instead of directing resources to stimulate domestic demand. But the problem is that is also our problem because it could lead to the so-called nuclear option, which is a mass devaluation. If Xi Jinping sees that there's no other option to save the Chinese economy, or even worse, to war if there is no other option to keep the economy rolling. And consider that that doesn't have to be so, not just because we have the precedent of a precedent where we could coexist with a rival like Japan in the 1980s and 90s peacefully, but also because there is we both China and us they have a lots of progress to make together in climate and other technologies if we can make sure we can have a peaceful coexistence if we can make sure we downgrade that arms race that is being pushed by Putin, basically. Number 6, America has to choose between FDR style internationalism and an America First hubris that could be translated into autarchy, which is unfeasible because many of the new technologies dependent on resources the U.S. doesn't have, at least on our soil, like rare earth or on imperial hubris. You believing that you can threaten small countries, like probably like Biden, like Trump is trying to do with Canada, Mexico, Panama, and others, and have no consequence, considering that those countries, in the worst case, have an alternative, that is China. Consider that the autarchy means self-sufficiency, and not just is inefficient, but no, consider that this dangerous approach embraced by Trump could lead to what KRUGMAN called, with respect to China, foreign adventurism. So that's which is what I mentioned, the military option in case nobody else works. For that, you have to take into account what are the plans of China for the global south. And of course, China doesn't want to go into a mass devaluation or much less a war. But if Xi Jinping has to choose between that and the collapse of the Chinese economy and the fall of the Chinese Communist Party, I don't believe it's going to be very difficult to imagine what what his choice is going to be. Number 7, in the not just in 1938, during the Second World War, especially and after the invasion of Russia in 1941, Churchill and FDR had to consider all the time the how to deal with Stalin, because Stalin, and he was right about that, was bearing the worst of the war, we dealing with Hitler's divisions, and as the advance of the German army stalled, there was a new concern for Churchill and FDR. What if Hitler realized that he could not win the war with Russia, and Stalin could cut a deal with Hitler? In other words, what if your ally decided that it was much in her best interest to give up on you, and that meant that all the German armies that were fighting in Russia could get back to Western Europe to make pretty much impossible an invasion of Italy in 1943 or D-Day in 1944. And you have to consider that, as I mentioned a moment ago, when you see Trump's MADMAN theory alienating allies, which may consider cutting their own deals with China, and with Putin elevated to the status of senior partner thanks to a victory over Ukraine, that is a very bad scenario. Now, number 8, Putin has raised many rationales for his aggression to Ukraine. One of them, and it's not different from the rationales raised by Hitler and Mussolini, that they demanded concessions, territorial concessions, to show them respect as global powers. Then the rationale of the existential threat, which has been raised by Putin with those words, that in those times that England and France wanted to annihilate Germany, and that Germany could win the war, which has been reproduced almost literally by Putin. That should be a sign about the imperial ambitions of your foes, that you are not going to appease with territorial concessions, as we saw in the case of Czechoslovakia and Austria. This is a lesson, though, about what you that this lesson also gives us some opportunity, though, because if the rationale, if Putin's rationale for the war is the existential threat of Russia, then he should not be he should not oppose a deal in which he withdraws from Ukraine in in exchange for Chinese guarantees about Russia's territorial integrity. Of course, that's an excuse, but at least it could help you expose that Putin's rationale is not different from Hitler's. Of course, the people are not going to know it unless you tell them. Has Biden told them? No, because he believes in the salami strategy. Do you remember in the past video how we spouse such baloney? Okay. Number 9. Different from Biden, FDR had to deal with legislation that was an obstacle to any help he wanted to provide to Churchill in 1940, and that was the Neutrality Act. And yet, FDR sought modifications in 1939 in October, so he could sell weapons to England and France on a catch and carry basis, which was a progress, because before the Neutrality Act wouldn't allow him to sell weapons to any belligerent, whether you were the aggressor or the victim. Then he even used ships, American ships under Panamanian registry to send those weapons to Churchill, to England, which is an example of how he even pushed the boundaries of the law in order to prevent what would have been a disaster, that would have been the fall of England. So what kept the Neutrality Act in place despite the evident danger represented by Nazism and fascism, where it was the isolationist position that believed naively on the oceans being a barrier big enough to keep America from European wars. That, and of course the traumas caused by World War One with respect to war profiteers and the horrors of trench warfare that maim and kill thousands of Americans. But now compare that to Biden not calling when the GOP blocked the aid to Ukraine. Biden not calling the GOP bluff to use send that aid to Ukraine through using a loan. What the hell matter if it was a loan or or if it was aid, as long as that aid arrived in time. If it's a loan, you could later condone that loan if necessary. Otherwise, you could help Ukraine to develop resources to pay that loan. Not just that, Biden could have used the Excess Defense Act to decommission weapons and to send them to Ukraine, because we are not talking here to top of the art weaponry. We are talking about the excedents. The excedents. We are talking about F-35s. We're talking about F-16s, just to give you an example. But no, Biden, because of her constant fears, his belief in the salami strategy, appeasement, or because he wanted to score points against the GOP, put that fundamental problem in foreign affairs at risk, and just compare that to FDR. After that, other ways FDR used to help Churchill included the so-called destroyer for bases, which implied sending Chamberlain 50 old destroyers in exchange of their bases in the Caribbean. The rationale used, the excuse used by Roosevelt was that those bases were necessary to prevent Hitler forces, in case of aggression, to attack the Panama Canal or the south of the United States. And that's why did he use that excuse? Because of he could not sell weapons on credit to Britain, and the opposition, the isolationist opposition, would not give him the votes to amend the cash and carry amendment in the Neutrality Act. So compare that the way, and this was in 1940. We're not talking about Lend-Lease. Lend-Lease would come in 1941. And it's not just Lend-Lease. Besides that, in 1941, FDR ordered the occupation of Greenland and Iceland to prevent Germany from using those territories to attack American supplies for England, and the excuse was that they could use those territories, Greenland and Iceland, to attack the United States. So compare how resourceful FDR was in order to prevent that the terrible consequences of Nazi victory for the United States, and compare that to Biden always trying to find excuses from the very first moment to provide aid to Zelensky that could have resulted in decisive outcomes. the outcomes that would have made the war shorter and successful, when now we are pretty much accepting that the war is going to be longer and is not going to be successful. And compare that to FDR, to the times FDR had to stand up and forcefully push the people in his own State Department, who were, many of them were isolationists, and many of them even supported Germany, because they considered that a German victory would weaken Russian communism, and consider that, as I mentioned before, the fierce opposition from Republicans and Democrats to helping England, because that would involve America in the war, as a very myopic point of view, because then what would happen if Hitler won? He would have been satisfied with that. He would have accepted that he was going to be unpopular, because the reconversion of the Germany's economy to a peace economy would be painful. No, they did those scenarios didn't cross the mind of these isolationists, and yet, and besides that, consider that in those times, the American army, we didn't have the resources or the preparedness to engage in war. Today, we take for granted that the U.S. Army is the number one army in the world. To that time, she was not even the third. So you can have an idea. Hitler's army at the time was over 6 million soldiers, seasoned soldiers with outdated artillery, tanks, and air power, while Americans' army was half a million and was poorly prepared. Basically, soldiers who had not seen uh, action in their lives. And yet, Biden didn't have to face those obstacles, and then he managed to screw up the 2023 counter-offensive. But when we come to preparedness, you saw that not just the FDR's war production board, as then would be retaken by Eisenhower in the Defense Production Act, meant a quick conversion of the American economy to war, to prepare war supplies. So the American army, who could be up to the task in the war that was unavoidable for the United States. Now consider that FDR had, different from Biden, had to work with an army that was unprepared. The training was poor, the army was too small, and the production of war materials was still had the lots to wish for. So, and FDR, despite all that, he managed to push resources through that Congress, through that hostile Congress, to convert the American economy and put it up to the task. And that's with his War Production Board idea that was then retaken later by Eisenhower's Defense Production Act. And that, and the case of the draft, because as today is the case in Ukraine, one of the big problems for Roosevelt was to train those people so they could use the war material properly. Compare that to Biden, that after had to wait for about 3 years to block the supplies necessary to allow troop rotation in Ukraine, and now they simply don't have enough seasoned soldiers to rotate troops so they can mix those seasoned soldiers with the green soldiers that thing that could have been cohesiveness to the brigades, to the 155 and 157 brigades that have failed in Pokrovsk. And yet FDR, different from Biden, proved that he was up to the task. So, in other words, Biden's appeasement allowed those materials that could have made a difference in the counteroffensive of 2023 were not on time, while FDR did his best and succeeded at converting the economies and the draft. So U.S. Army would be up to the task when the time came. And FDR had to make many excuses with the Allies at first, because the army was not prepared. And that was a very stressful test for FDR, and yet he did it. So by the time the U.S. Army finally made its appearance in the Torch operation in North Africa, it succeeded. Another huge obstacle faced by FDR and not by Biden, because Biden precisely did the opposite, was public support. While Biden managed to alienate people who at first supported Ukraine, FDR had to deal with very adverse public support. In 1940, in the early 1940, 79% of Americans favor increased military spending, but not involvement in the war, even if France and England were losing. 75% favor peace with Hitler. And even after Hitler invaded Denmark and Norway, and Belgium and in the Netherlands, the isolationist sentiment was still strong. The Battle of Britain, which was this battle to prevent the invasion of England by Germany, increased the American support to 52% in favor of England, and yet isolationism was too strong, because even then the public didn't support the involvement of the USA in the war. At that time, there was nothing less than a national hero like Charles Lindbergh leading the isolationist sentiment and accusing Roosevelt of wanting to take USA to the war and become a dictator. What forced FDR to be extremely cautious despite the evolution of the work in Europe, to be very cautious in his demands from Congress. At first, it was to just to increase the national defense, and but still, it was the progress was very slow because it was not easy to break that isolationism that was in terms of priorities was number two after the economy in the polls ran at the time. Why FDR persisted in, in that mission that was putting even at risk his beloved New Deal, because he realized that the European conflict was one the USA could not lose to afford. And that brings us to the narrative of, so FDR understood that European conflict was fundamental for America's future, while Biden never framed the war in Ukraine in terms of American interests. He came with this nonsense about the big guy abusing of the small guy. So we, the good guys, we will help the small guy to get even, so to make the fight fair, as if this were a back alley fist fight. So compare the two, and yeah, what inspired FDR's narrative was that he had cleared the threat of that that Hitler's victory could represent, the way Biden never had cleared the threat Putin's victory could represent. So consider that Biden started with high support for Ukraine, and FDR started with extremely low support for England. Even the Republicans had to pressure Biden because Biden gave great speeches, but when the time came to deliver on those speeches, Biden made all kinds of excuses and wanted to limit the help to Ukraine to only defensive weapons and use it only inside Ukraine, and with all kind of stupid constraints that defeated the purpose. FDR had even to, in 1941, had to pressure his own, while Biden had to be pressured by Republicans to deliver the so-promised weapons to Ukraine. FDR had to pressure his own State and War departments, even had to replace those secretaries because they were not in sync with FDR mission. So that gives you an idea of the huge difference between the two. Now, number 11. As I mentioned, even FDR's own war and Navy departments, besides his state, the State Department, were filled with people who either wanted to avoid war at all costs, so the kind of people I have called peace over war, cake over soup, and naive isolationism that could have only led to a much worse war in the future. Or were people who wanted to use Hitler to defeat Russian communism, as if they had a formula to then contain the damage of Hitler victory in Russia that would have, to begin with, would have brought the three armies Hitler had in Russia back to Western Europe, making much more difficult any attempt at liberating Europe. At some point, his own ambassador to England, John Kennedy, urged him to pressure Poland. You remember how they have pressured Czechoslovakia before? Well, yeah, now it was also Poland, as if the Czechoslovakia debacle had not happened. To pressure Poland to agree to Germany's invasion in order to prevent war. Joe Kennedy, in this case, was an example of the appeasement that was supreme in the State Department, and that forced FDR to use his own channels through the Navy to bypass the State Department in order to send orders and communications. The same way, some short-sighted people wanted to use Hitler to contain Russian communism. Today, some people are proposing caving to Putin's aggression and readmit it to the West in order to contain who? China, which is pretty naive if you think it thoroughly, because if you were Putin, would you get back to the West knowing well that the next elections could bring somebody with a completely different opinion and turn your back in your more reliable ally, China? It's pretty ridiculous, right? And as I mentioned, I have a video about the excuse of World War III, which I consider nonsense. Nonsense in the case of Putin, but not nonsense in the case. Let me make this clarification. Not nonsense if we push Putin and Xi to a point where their power is really at risk. So if we push them together and push the Chinese economy to a point where it could collapse, or Putin to similarly a piece that Putin could not preserve, otherwise his economy would collapse, then we could have a real case of a scenario, a World War III scenario. But that if the point is, but if we want to invoke the image of World War III as an excuse to surrender Ukraine to Putin, as Joe Kennedy wanted to surrender Poland to Hitler, or other isolationists wanted to surrender Czechoslovakia to Hitler, then we are talking that's nonsense, and that's a very dangerous nonsense, because it could lead to that point of no return. That means the worst case scenario, a war with both Russia and China. So that brings us to number 12. What should be our goal? The top criterion that guides us in these decisions is to deal with China, try to get a trade deal with China, and isolate Putin, because that's the only way we could. So if we turn Putin into Xi Jinping's vassal, and it's in the best interest of both the United States and China to backpedal on this arms race that is as dangerous as the arm race of the 30s was in the case of Germany, because it's either that or prepare for war. And that would be a very bad, a very ugly scenario. And having said that, let me leave you with our newscast.
Good evening. This is Brian Thomas Simons, and these are the main headlines of this hour. Among other news,
Oscars shortlist announced. Amelia Perez, a powerful movie that shows that the only way for cis heterosexual men to be good goes through the scalpel. Change sex or lose your soul. Epic. B. She Exorcist versus the Patriarchy. Two women come out of retirement to exorcise the patriarchy. Meet the real source of evil in this brave story where two feminist women expose the uselessness of white men, and even the possessor is a female demon. Unbelievable. Nerve-wracking. C. Snow White, the story of a spoiled girl who, through the power of her temper tantrums, brought an entertainment corporation to the edge. See her turn into a leader, save the useless prince, and start a bloody rebellion against the evil queen that will end with her gory death. Powerful, unforgettable songs. PG-13D. Wicked. See a capricious diva survive the fanarts that offend her. Let the Wicked Witch of the West steal your heart with her endless complaints and whine. More unforgettable songs. More powerful. PG-13E. I'm Still Here, the fictional story of Rachel Zegler. A survivor. No matter how many movies she sinks, she will always have the contacts to land another one. A life lesson. Touching. F. Condoms to Hamas. A president on a mission stops a shipment of condoms for Hamas. Learn the hidden secret behind this conspiracy. Terrorist condoms who embodied Hamas's hatred for freedom. An intelligent thriller that will keep you on the edge from minute one. Acclaimed in Cannes. A Steven Spielberg movie.
this has been the news of this hour. Sponsored by Church of the Holy Redeemer's Power in the Spirit. Have you accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Savior? Did you vote for Trump in 2016 and then in 2020? This is the right church for you. If so, Church of the Holy Redeemer's Power in the Spirit is the only Christian church that can promise you in the Lord to have 72 virgins in heaven for only a donation of $50 a month. You will have access to those 72 virgins in heaven. For an additional $25, you will be allowed to replace 10 of them, and for $100, Heaven Premium, you will be allowed to choose them for yourself. Guaranteed, if you're not satisfied with those 72 virgins after you die, full refund of your money. We accept Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover.